Hear the word of the Lord from Psalm 145. My soul yearns for you, eternal flame of love, longing to reconnect to the great mystery. Every day I will bless you as I follow the voice of truth. Great are you who call us to childlike wonder, to the healing balm of forgiveness. Each generation must learn anew the efficacy of silence, the wisdom of turning inward, that your light might be their guide to holiness, and your love nurture them towards wholeness. Yet many there are who turn from you in fear, denying their birthright. Their denials will lead them further into alienation. Loneliness will companion them. The beloved is gracious and merciful, allowing every soul free will to follow the ego's illusions or choose life. Gratitude and quiet joy overflow as I recall the abundant blessings of your grace. Lift up your hearts, all you who choose the path of life. My heart is lifted up.
Do you not know that your whole being is encompassed by my love? I am the infinite and the eternal within your soul. Oh, that I might make myself known to you. Choose love that you might overcome oppression and blind obedience to false idols. Divine light shines in those who live in love. I shall uphold all who are burdened with fear and raise up all who call to me. The time is nigh for you to choose, for great is the new dawn that fast approaches. I call each of you to open your inner ears, to see with spiritual eyes, and to trust that even amidst the outward chaos, all is working toward the wholeness of humanity. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
This morning we begin a new series titled Free to Worship, and it's going to take us on a 9-week journey through the Psalms. And it's a part of our overall theme this year, exploring freedom. Now, the Psalms are important not just because they are, by sheer volume, the largest book in our Holy Scriptures, but because they serve as something to be read, something to be meditated on, something to be sung. And what we have are the lyrics gathered over a 900-year period, which give voice to struggle, longing, joy, distress, and the deliverance of God's people. And these words give us liberty in every generation to create music to accompany them, to give shape to our own worshiping life. So as we take in some of the length and breadth of the Psalms, we're invited to reorient our lives because the Psalms engage the human experience in ways that we feel some discomfort in doing so. You see, the Psalms do not tell us to play dress up when what we are walking through is more like the valley of the shadow of death than the superlatives of mountaintop experiences. So the Psalms invite us to pray and sing what is actually in our hearts, not some projection, some voice of expectation that says, this is what should be there. Because the Psalms are signposts of reality, not a denial of its contours. And so, the Psalms are full of lament. We find anger at injustice. we find crippling doubts, moments of desperation where the writer is waiting for God's intervention. So there are songs of hunger and thirst. Some are descriptive at someone who is at a crossroad, and many are replete with songs of praise and gratitude. You see, the Psalms are not just an old book. They are a living one. They are a living book that has the texture and grit and imagination and a sense of wonder of our lives. The reason being is because they are descriptive of the context of our life, and they are an invitation to live more deeply into our faith. It is as if the writer, with a flashlight in hand, with little clues and instruction, watch that, look out for this. The Psalms lead us on a path. Walter Brueggemann writes this: over the generations, the community of faith has resonated with the words of the Psalms because they are a spokenness that is daring and subversive, attuned to the reality of human hurt and to the splendor of holy power. Now, we might struggle with the Psalms. We might misunderstand the Psalms and perhaps even dismiss them because, after all, they're poetry. Their rhythms do not immediately follow how we talk. We don't talk like this. And so we wonder, for example, why they often repeat themselves. There's a line, and then they pretty much say the same thing again. And we're like, are they a little slow, the Hebrews? Anyway, this is a form of writing called Hebrew parallelism. So I thought, with the assistance of a few readers among you, we would give you some examples. So beginning with Psalm 145. Cindy, help us out.
I will exalt my God, the King. I will praise his name ever and ever. Great is the Lord, most worthy to be praised. His greatness, no one can fathom.
And in the more familiar words of Psalm 42, this parallelism is also demonstrated. Where's Marilyn? There you are.
The deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God.
Now, sometimes this parallelism, there's a much more direct equivalency from line to line. In other cases, the first line is kind of expanded on, almost as if you're listening to an external processor think about what the first line was when they offer the second line. Craig, would you externally process for us?
I remember the days long ago. I meditate on all your works, consider what your hands have done.
Thank you. Eugene Peterson, who is a poet himself, explains that poetry is language that contains a kind of personal intensity. It is not, he cautions us, probably with a stern look, it is not just decorative speech. Poetry adjusts our eyes, blurred with too much distraction, and our ears dulled with too much noise. It is the poets, he says, and I would add the songwriters who pull us into reality. Because the psalmists speak poetically, they speak to us and for us. The deep within them calls out to the deep within us, Bernard Anderson writes. From another aspect, they are an artist who is painting a picture of their journey, wanting to evoke emotion, not just articulate words. They want to provoke thought, and in it we feel the way that they are wrestling with their own circumstance. So there's a way in which sort of the poetry of it all draws us in and invites our attention. And so the Psalms for us are very much about us finding company for our own lives in these words. But to do so, we need to confess the experiences in our lives that the Psalms are just more honest about than we might be ready to be. So, to engage the Psalms, we need to be willing to have our souls stretched out, redrawing the boundary lines of what we might pray or sing. And in doing so, we actually, by invitation of the Psalms, live with more authenticity with our own lives. The early church father Athanasius said this: "Nothing to be found in the human life has been omitted in the Psalms. All of it is there." Walter Brueggemann described the Psalms of Lament, which are basically complaints, as words that live closest to our deepest hurt and most intimate groan. Now, we've all had the experience, and I digress, we've all had the experience of sharing something deeply personal with something with maybe more gravitas, something with more emotion, and we look at the person we're talking to and realizing they've checked out of this conversation. Or we see the discomfort tracing a map across their face as to how do I get out of this conversation. The Psalms don't do that. The Psalms are present to us in all of the circumstances of our life, and by the fact that the Psalms have been included in our holiest of books, it says it's okay to think this way. It's okay to feel this way. It's completely appropriate to bring all of these kinds of experiences to God. Now, for those of you who were able to be with us for our Maundy Thursday service during Easter week a few months ago, we joined in this great tradition as we prayed together a liturgy of lament that was based out of Psalm 13. Likewise, we created a lament wall, which we have downstairs in the office. We're still lamenting. We have this lament wall, which gave us a space to name our own story, our lived struggles, our dis-ease with how things are going in our world. And we were able to voice these things. And in putting them on the lament wall, realizing, I have company in this struggle with these people that I'm in community with. But the reality is, it is more our tendency not to want to go to these places. But the Psalms and our willingness to go to these places offers us a path of healing. So for us to begin to talk about being free to worship, we need to begin by, first of all, understanding this, that the Psalms are reality reorienting. The Psalms are reality reorienting. And secondly, they embrace and live in and articulate the broad landscape of human experience. So we have this sense in which the Psalms are present to reality. Now, to begin with, they are present to our human reality. But as we look at the Psalms, there is also this other reality in which the human reality is lived. And this is a God reality. There is a God reality where all of life is lived under the gaze of God. And so, in order to experience freedom in worship, we bring the human reality. We confess the God reality. And we pray and we sing and we long for and we are desperate for the union of these, where these two engage together. The freedom to worship begins with bringing all of life to God. On the surface, we could just read the Psalms as part of some Bible reading plan. Oh, how many Psalms do I have today? Oh, 2 Psalms. Okay, hope they move along. And it would be easy for us to incorporate them in our worship as if they're part of our liturgy and, these are the things that we pray or sing. But it's vital for us to realize that every one of these Psalms had a context all of their own. That these were written in the midst of a story, of a human life. And so there is this sense that we need to kind of have in mind as we read and sing that these Psalms are actually a road that someone was traveling. And this was their best expression of their own experience. And so their words are meant to draw us in, not just to their story, yes, if we can understand their story, but they're meant to invite us into our own. So there's a way in which the Psalms give us back our life. I'm excited about it. Are you? But because these words are prayed and sung and incorporated into worship, we must also realize that their power, the power of these Psalms, is grounded in the hope and the longing for God to hear them. The reason we have these words is because even in the midst of their struggle, there was a sense, even if they were crossing their fingers and articulating it in some sense of desperation, that they were in fact praying them into the ears of someone else who could do something about it. And that this God in whom they lived and moved and had their being was in relationship with them. And while they did not always, and they say it in the Psalms, understand God's actions or inactions, God's silence or God's delays, they prayed in faith because they knew something about this God. They rehearsed something about the history of their people where this God had met them and delivered them. And so the writers, in a sense, believed in a God-created world. And so, to be free to worship is to be free to bring all that we are to this God. There is something about the context of the Psalms and I want to kind of articulate this, that is circumstantial. We've been talking about this. It is highly relational, and it is experiential. The Psalms are not written by someone who was given the task, can you go over, and sit at your desk, and we need something kind of, catch our attention, something nicely musical, something that seems, approachable and human. And could you go over there and pen these, please? And the person would use their best imagination to conjure up feelings that they don't actually have. But this isn't the case. The Psalms are rooted in a circumstance, in relationship, and real experience. Miroslav Volf says this. He said, God is the most important circumstance in my life. And initially I was like, that is so irreverent, Miroslav. God is more than a circumstance. But then I realized that he had in mind the fact that what he was walking through wasn't just his life, or his life lived in a neighborhood or in a community of faith. But he was like, no, it's actually bigger than this, that I am living in God's world, that I am living in this circumstance that is imbued with the life of God. And so, the invitation to us is, how are we living with this God consciousness? I remember someone using this phrasing, practical atheism, when we live as if God doesn't exist, or God has nodded off. He's having a nice Sunday afternoon nap after a big meal. We could all understand if God nodded off. But there are ways in which we walk through life even thinking, oh, God doesn't have time for this. He's not paying attention to this. I remember somebody saying, these people that pray for parking spots. Oh my gosh. I went, really? You live in the suburbs, don't you? You better believe you pray for a parking spot, and I pray that I don't get a ticket out in front of Holy Family when I leave my car too long. You better believe I pray about all of it. Anyway, the invitation is to realize that God, who created us, has not lost interest in us. That somehow the wonder of creation has turned to the mundane, boring, really, you're going to wear that to work today? Anyway, but God is interested in it all. And we can pray out of all of it. So we hear in the words of Psalm 139, for example, that might be familiar to some of us, this God consciousness. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. God's already there. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Where can I go from your spirit? The Psalms asks it. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, God's already there. And your right hand will hold me fast. So our daily life is lived in the context of a God who listens, who looks upon us with love, who joins us in our studies and in our vocation, who pays close attention to our relational longings and struggles, who hears our explicit prayers and our unspoken aches. God is attuned to all of it. This is the context in which we live. And there is an invitation. Will we read them? Will we take them into our confessional life? Will we hear the call to faith that is woven into these words? will we join in worship that is made more free because God is present there. You see, our worship, while, yes, it's what we're doing now between 10 a.m. and 11:30 on a Sunday, it is much more than that. It is much more than that, because we are created in God's image. We have been made to flourish. We have been shown the hospitality of God. And so our worship, what we might do during this time, is a response to the fact that God has embraced us. Now, I wanted to draw a little analogy as to the interplay of context, circumstances, and invitation. Last week, over the 4th of July holiday, my daughter Kate and I headed out of Sonora Pass into the wilderness. It tracks part of the Pacific Crest Trail, and we headed south and picked up a small trail down to Latopi Lake. Now, here's a glimpse of what we initially saw. Now, this trip seemed straightforward. As we looked at the map, as we looked at pictures people had taken, as we listened to, you know how people want to blog about their experiences, and so they did. We read it, we thought, oh, that's great, no problem. We can do this, you know. I'm so young, you know. Kate's, yes, really young. But to understand the context, we have to add some details. This is the context of the backcountry. The reality was, our hike began at some 9,600 feet, with another 1,500 to maybe 2,000 feet of climbing over the next couple of miles. Now, this kind of altitude means one thing in theory. I'm like, who wouldn't want to be at 10,000 feet? Maybe not your lungs. And so, what the map didn't tell us, you know, there wasn't a warning on the map. If you live in the Bay Area and you're just so soft and you live at sea level, this is going to crush your lungs. And so on the way, like, it was unbelievable. It's like, Kate was quite merciful to me. I would have to stop, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got a headache, and if I would bend over, I would get lightheaded. And I'm like, this was not part of anybody's blog. And so what would have been a relatively short hike became a much longer hike. But this is the context. But if I were to say to you, you know, that my crushing lungs were the only context to the trip, you're like, why did you bother going? You see, when we looked at pictures of the trip to Latopi Lake, the location, I looked at this one website, and there was like this red overlay to this whole section, and I'm like, oh, we're going to be right over here. And it said Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center. I didn't tell Kate about that. No, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. They're training there? You can imagine why. So, add snow in July. This is not a picture from the winter. This is like snow in July, and there were long switchbacks, and we had at times to traverse patches of snow, and then there was water we had to cross. And now we're filling in the context of our backpacking song. But you see, there was something that was very compelling to me. When I was searching for a place to hike, I had some qualifications. I'm like, well, I don't want it to be too hot, and I really would like to avoid bugs, all those kinds of things. But then I saw this picture of this turquoise blue lake amidst 10,000-foot peaks everywhere. And I said, I want me some of that context. But said in another way, there was a way we responded to the invitation of this lake. And I thought to myself, this would make a great father-daughter hike. But the reality was it asked more of us than we planned on giving. At one point, Kate said very eloquently, I have this love-hate relationship with backpacking. It's kind of like you go backpacking and you come back and you have to forget the struggle and remember and the happy pictures. And so we made our way to Lake Latopia where temperatures, remember last week when it was 105, 110? We were in 80-degree maximum heat. There were no bugs to speak of, a nice breeze that came through the valley. There was this creek that was constantly running, to which, and I jumped the gun, I started to call it, we're in Latopia. Anyway, the backcountry, like the Psalms, have a context. Elevation, climbing, toe-crushing descents, traversing creeks, and camping near ice-cold lakes. But there's also this invitation. It invites us to come into this kind of solitude and let nature, and for us, the presence of God, untangle the knots in our soul. This was after we plunged into Latopia Lake, and it was as cold as advertised. Shiver me timbers. And the interesting thing was, while we were there at the lake, all of a sudden something caught my eye that was like in the air. And it was a guy parasailing from like one of the peaks up above and landed in the lake in his wetsuit. And anyway, the Psalms, for all of their rich language, reveal profound human experiences and invite us into something. The Psalms invite us into something, and they let us know that our struggle and our worship and all of life can be infused with the life of God. So for all the ways that Kate and I were company for each other, struggled to acclimate, squealed with delight jumping into the lake, bravely embarked out in front of a waterfall. I'm not showing you that video. I don't want to startle Mother, but you did this? Yeah, no, it was totally safe, totally. We vetted it, but yes, we made our way out onto this rock in the middle of this waterfall. It was awesome. Wasn't it awesome, Kate? It was great. And we worshiped. That made it spiritual. You can laugh at that. So all that the Psalms invite for us is to enter into a deeper, more expansive freedom. And at the heart of this is a relationship. It is always at the heart. Relationship, encounter with God. And so I would say this as we begin this series on free to worship, that the conditions which create a worshipful heart on Sunday are probably as much about what you're doing on Monday, about something you read, about a walk in nature, about listening with a friend, about sitting in quiet. Because all of these things form who we are and what we bring to what we particularly call worship. Because it's all worship. Psalm 42, I wonder if we could read this together. Is it already up there? Let's read this aloud together. Like the deer that yearns for running streams, So my soul is yearning for you, my God. My soul is thirsting for God, the living God. The psalmist goes on to ask, I love this question, when can I enter to see the face of God? And so our worship is shaped by our deepening knowing, relational knowing of God. So God's reaching toward us, is creating in us, is forming us with a capacity to join God in their life. So the more we engage this God, the more fluent we become in worship. And I would add this, the more embodied and wholehearted our worship would be. You see, worship comes from this place of relationship with God, which realizes how extraordinary it is that we are made in the image of God for a relationship with God. This is our invitation in the Psalms. How might we, over the course of the next couple of months, be made more free, more present to our own life, more free in our worship? Amen.